University on the
Sorry,
no, that's all right. I'd forgotten. That's good. On the unceded and unsurrendered territory of the Algonquin peoples, otherwise also known as the settler colonial state of Canada. And we are very pleased to be putting on, this is actually our second annual, we're hoping annual, panel series, and the first of this year's series in 2023. And this year, the whole series is focused on youth activism, broadly construed. The word activism has lots of associations, we might call it baggage. So we're taking it very broadly: youth participation, youth citizenship, children and youth engagement, and talking about all of those pieces. Now, we have a kind of self-interested reason for doing this, and I want to give full kudos to Shihan Erdal, who is the coordinator of the Center for Urban Youth Research, who is really the person who is putting in the kind of grunt work of pulling this panel together. He's a phenomenal organizer. And Shihan and I are also working together on a youth activist handbook. And some of the people on this screen, in fact, are going to be receiving invitations shortly to contribute. And we're also, learning who else is out there. It's a handbook being put out by De Gruyter Press. It's meant to be a kind of overview of like, what is this field of youth activism? We have lots of knowledge and literature on activism and social movements, but not anything in a collection. That's probably a bit too broad, not a handbook anyways, on youth activism. And so part of the task is defining what it is. Defining is too strong. Discussing what it is, and looking at the ways in which it's distinct from social movements, literature, and academic study, as well as the ways in which it overlaps, the ways in which it's distinct from and overlaps with youth studies, with sociology, with child studies. There are lots of contributing fields that have informed our understanding of youth activism, again, taking maybe both of those categories, youth and activism, quite broadly. So this is our first panel, and today we're focusing on methods and methodology. Very exciting. We have a very distinguished panel of speakers and an international panel of speakers. And we have an international moderator, Nia Rees, who's at Cardiff University. And I'm going to turn it over to Nia now to intro the panel process and the speakers. So thank you everyone for coming. And Nia will talk about when there'll be discussion and those things during the panel.
Hello, croeso, welcome. Yes, as Jackie just said, I'm Nia Rees. I'm a PhD researcher at the School of Geography and Planning in Cardiff, which is in Wales. So we're all over the time zones here, but we'll work with it. Yeah, it's my pleasure today to be the moderator. My research focuses on youth homelessness, prevention, and family mediation. So I'm really excited to hear everything that the speakers have got to say today. So we've got three wonderful speakers, as you already know. As our first speaker gets their screen ready, I'll just talk through how we're going to work this today. So we've got 20 minutes per speaker, and then we'll have a couple of minutes initially after each speaker, just to have any initial feedback or comments from each of the speakers to each other, and then we'll move on, and we'll have a good half an hour at the end, maybe 20 minutes to have questions from you all as participants. So you can get your thinking caps on, anything that you'd like to know about further, or any questions you have at the very end. But please do throughout use the comment box, any questions or anything you want to bring up, and we can address those as we go along, or make sure we've got all your questions by the end. So Rebecca, would you like to start sharing your screen for us, just as I introduce you? So yes, we have Professor Rebecca Raby as our first speaker, who's going to explore the significance of participatory and innovative methods in youth activism research, and in particular looking at some of the potential difficulties in using these approaches. Yes, so we're honoured to have you here. So we'll start off with you, Rebecca, and I'll give you a wave at the 15-minute mark. So Rebecca, fire away. Diolch, thank you.
Oops. Okay, can everybody hear me? Excellent. All right, so first of all, I speak to you today from Niagara, Ontario, the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples. This territory is covered by the Upper Canada Treaties and is within the land protected by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Agreement. And I acknowledge this territory in order to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to building positive relationships between nations and in developing a deep understanding of Indigenous peoples and their cultures. So welcome. For my talk, this is going to be a bit more of an overview-y part of the panel today. I'm going to talk a little bit about the emergence of interactive arts-based and participatory methodologies in research with children and youth, and especially in relationship to power. And I'm going to reflect on some of the promises and challenges and think about some strategies going forward. And while this panel is focused on the experiences of youth activists, a lot of my thinking comes from child studies, and also even that line between child and youth is super fuzzy. There'll be a good dose of stuff here that's related to both children and youth. All right, so in the late 20th century, there was a significant shift, as many of you likely know, in child and youth studies towards much greater research engagement with children and youth, based on the recognition that children and youth are worthy, agentic people with their own valuable cultures and contributions. While much research remains top-down, relying on adult observations and consultations and adult-devised unidirectional surveys with children and youth. Sorry, I was getting distracted there for a second. So even though we have a lot of top-down research that's still going on, and at the end, I'm going to note that some of it is actually still really important. There's been concerns about that kind of research as well. And in response, there's been a really exciting explosion of other kinds of more interactive research, including arts-based, and more participatory research, including arts-based. And these are sort of about really deeply engaging with children and youth themselves. So I'm making a distinction here. By interactive, I mean the kind of research that we do through, interviews, ethnographies, observations, case studies, that's foregrounding the voices of children and youth, and in a way that's sort of not so possible with top-down research. But this is different than more participatory approaches. And you can have interactive being arts-based, but it doesn't always have to be arts-based. So in terms of participatory research, how am I distinguishing that from interactive research? Usually it's focused, there's a whole lot of different kinds, and they tend to be focused on sort of aiming towards genuine research collaboration with community participants. And it's usually initiated with more marginalized communities. And the goals are around empowerment and social change at the local and sometimes even the broader level. And the aim here is to draw on community knowledge and processes that can make that research more meaningful and also more successful, in terms of, like, especially if we're thinking about drawing on the arts and what kinds of arts-based components might be meaningful to the participants. And just as a really fleeting example, there's a great video online called School Sweet School, and it's about a project in Senegal where the students in this school were involved in creating the research questions. They conducted interviews with each other in a fairly quantitative way, interestingly enough. And then they compile the data that they found, and then they participated in creating the video. So being involved in that participatory research from beginning to end, although you can also have I think you can also have participatory research where it's only a segment, right? Like you can have participants involved in devising the questions and doing data analysis, but not knowledge mobilization, for example. So interactive and participatory projects have been increasingly arts-based. And again, you can use the arts in so many different components, right? They've been incorporated into processes of trying to gain assent and consent. So for example, through drawing projects, collecting data through theater, through photographs, journaling, through data analysis. There's examples of people doing cool work with collages, for example, and poetry. And then also, of course, in knowledge mobilization. Something like play building works very well for sort of transcending those divisions within a research approach and sort of mixing, like creating questions and data collection and knowledge mobilization all into a sort of iterative project that participants are involved in from beginning to end and involving art. So one really exciting aspect of arts-based research is that it allows for accessible multisensory engagement. As Marnina Gonik states, arts-based approaches may offer access to ways of knowing and routes to knowledge that include, but are not limited by, rationality and existing language. So in this way, it can be empowering, in fact, especially for folks who may sometimes be marginalized by more sort of adult-based or language-based or what someone might call dry forms of research, and that would include children and potentially youth. Arts-based research processes can also slow the process down and focus on that process and require that researchers are really sort of more engaged in the moment with what it is that's happening in that research project. Both the process and the outcomes of art-based projects can also foster empathy and awareness about other people's experiences. So for instance, the picture on this slide is from a research project by Diane Farmer, who's a Canadian researcher. And she was doing work with new immigrant Francophone participants, and they had these sort of outlines of their bodies created, and then they were able to color in the different components of their body that sort of fit with where they sort of felt like their cultural attachments were, and then they were able to talk about that. And so in that process of sort of relationship building in the research, and also in the end, sort of creating like a picture like the one that we can see, which is really compelling for observers to think about, is a way that arts-based research can really sort of open our eyes in not just language-based ways of seeing other things that are going on in the world. So of course, power and inequality are central to some of these shifts that we've seen in research focus. In the mid to late 20th century, many scholars and activists, well, some scholars and many activists within research communities were problematizing instances where Western researchers would turn up, especially in Indigenous communities, and sort of, just collect data and then leave in very problematic ways, both in the North and in the global South, in ways that were really extractive and non-consultative and ultimately othering. And this sort of recognition of some of the challenges around power in the collection of data were taken up by child and youth scholars, particularly in the 1990s, who started to really think about the distribution of power in terms of age, as well as other kinds of inequalities. And thinking about how so many research projects reflect adults' interests and questions and their favored methods, but also often would come with assumptions about children and youth, particularly marginalized children and youth, as having deficiencies that somehow that research is seeking to address. So attention to these kinds of unequal distributions of power have often reflected a standpoint approach, or some people talk about positionality, which assumes that a person's social location reflects privilege or inequality and shapes their experiences and viewpoints. And for this reason, it's vital that we foreground the voices and viewpoints of those people who are being studied, as they are assumed to have, as Spyrou states, a more real, truthful, and valid view of their lives. Often such work comes from a humanist location which focuses on individual agency, self-knowledge, and access to truth. As the late Barry Mail and others have argued, children and youth occupy an unequal age-based positionality, which is in turn intersected by other locations of privilege and/or inequality. And for this reason, children and youth, including young activists, must be directly involved in research about their lives and communities. The options and collaborations of arts-based and participatory approaches have been experienced and thought about and talked about as really exciting ways to do this. But they're also tricky. So the first thing I want to talk about is representation. No group is homogeneous, of course, and while shared experiences of inequalities and injustice can powerfully shape our experiences, people's experiences and understanding of them are not only shaped by their social location. And furthermore, as Crenshaw's attention to intersectionality points out, we never occupy a single social location, and there is not one singular hierarchy of power. So who then represents a group of people like children, youth, or young activists in a research project, including a participatory research project? Furthermore, some community members may try to speak for all, and other community members may be silenced or face significant costs for being involved in research. And I think we also have to consider that sometimes an outsider is able to ask questions and hear stories and see things that insiders cannot. Second, many have argued that the ongoing authority, status, and resources of researchers are very difficult to rebalance in research projects, even participatory ones. And this is particularly the case when adults are working with children. Many have talked about how researchers frequently have institutional demands that they have to meet that make things complicated as well, including meeting ethics board requirements, reporting protocols, standards of so-called high quality research, and showing speedy, quantifiable deliverables such as presentations and reports and papers. These demands can be especially tough when arts-based and participatory research take significant time, and when participants' goals and ideas and preferred processes don't actually always fit with academic understandings of what high quality research might look like. So how do we make room for that, while at the same time working within institutional contexts? Now, I do want to note that in some sectors, we have seen some positive shifts. For example, some recognition of alternative forms of outputs, particularly through decolonization initiatives, where, for instance, things like community consultation, that's starting in some sectors to be recognized as a so-called deliverable. Sorry. That it's recognized that certain kinds of research takes more time to do. I'm just going to cough more for a second. All right. And so that's exciting. And similarly, we've seen some pushback on research ethics boards where people have been saying, wait a second, we need to be able to accommodate arts-based research, child and youth-based research, and participatory forms of research. But I do worry about how many innovative research projects do not actually happen because researchers, and especially students, assume, and maybe rightly, that their research ethics board will not approve their project. And there are other challenges too. Community and activist agendas can diverge from research agendas, and that can make collaboration difficult. This challenge can be exacerbated when hoped for social change doesn't happen in the way that it was imagined, if at all. Further, participants' views might be challenging for the researcher in terms of being far more activist-oriented or far less activist-oriented than the researchers are comfortable with. Participatory research also places significant demands, well, and sometimes arts-based research places significant demands on participants' time. Young people may be at a time when their lives are changing quite quickly, and they might not be consistently interested in or available to do a research project, which is totally fair. For young activists, there's another dimension to consider, and that's that as a fully participatory project that takes a lot of time, it can actually, ironically, shift that young person's interests away from their community, their activist community, and then make it harder for them to sort of be seen as representing that community. And then finally, various scholars have raised concerns that this push towards children and youth participation, including participation in research, can become governmental, with participants guided towards and evaluated on Western middle-class forms of voice and activism. Spyru notes that projects focused on developing marginalized young people into independent, competent, self-reflexive, self-directed actors can be experienced by marginalized young people as alienating and colonizing. Kennelly, Jackie here, has grappled with this issue in her research with homeless youth and rightly argues that instead we need to recognize and embrace the skills of the young people we are working with. So where does this take us? These concerns, these exciting promises of arts-based and participatory approaches alongside these really sobering concerns. So what then? First, it's important to recognize these challenges rather than to gloss over them. Research always needs boundaries, leading to the exploration of certain questions over others and the involvement of some potential participants and not others. There's no singular view or voice of children and or youth, and all viewpoints are partial, and this is okay. We need to note these boundaries, talk about who we have involved and why, and reflect on the consequent limitations. Similarly, hierarchies and related inequalities are always going to be present, but we must be attentive to them and draw on question and context-specific approaches to research to try to mediate them. For example, through drawing on interactive, arts-based, and participatory approaches. So whenever I face sort of language where sort of people talk about a participatory approach as if it somehow overcomes power inequalities, I always feel really cautious, and I may say, well, we could talk about mediating them maybe instead. And we have to remember the messiness also of real life research. And I say this especially for graduate students who are trying to produce manageable dissertations. Researchers are working within specific community and institutional contexts that shape and limit the research process. And participants also face demands that can shape or prevent their research involvement. So we need to recognize these limitations and work within them. So I worry, for example, if people feel that sort of the new gold standard of research with young people, including activist young people, is that we have to do a really highly involved form of participatory research. I worry that that will paralyze people and prevent some other kinds of projects from happening that can also be really important projects that still foreground young people and their concerns. All right. Secondly, there are many exciting theoretical orientations under the umbrellas of post-structuralism and now post-humanism and new materialism or relationality that challenge some of the humanistic assumptions about unidirectional power, individualized agency, and data as truth. And I think that those approaches can also lend some useful information to these kinds of discussions. They emphasize that the flows of power can be complicated in all forms of research. And so I do think it's important to be attentive to the authority, skills, and status and resources of like a researcher coming from a university context. But I think sometimes, well, it's also very important to be attentive to the ways that young people within research projects also participate in shaping that project, sometimes whether the researcher recognizes and acknowledges that or not. These theorists argue that agency is not individually held, but instead produced through interactions that involve all components of a research process, including non-human aspects such as the environment and technology, All are transformed through the research process, and data is contextually produced within these assemblages. So emphasis so if we recognize and emphasize these kinds of interdependence and relationality, and we see it in the research because it's there, and we also kind of go into it, that we can then see like a sort of blurring of insider outsider. We can see the collaboration, the importance of collaboration around insider outsider, the collaboration between children, adults, and youth, and the mutual learning that happens and the relationality that happens in those projects. And I think that can sort of help us. Again, it doesn't sort of make power disappear, but it helps us to sort of recognize it and also recognize the complexities of it. And finally, we need to value multiple forms of research, which I've already been hinting at. I don't think there is like a gold standard for research into the lives of children and or youth, including activist youth. Arts-based and participatory approaches offer very exciting possibilities, but they're not without concerns. And there's a significant place for, I think there is still a significant place for conventionally interactive or top-down research, depending on the research question and the context of that research. But across these approaches, we need to be transparent about the context and processes, including our own location within them, and to consistently reflect on relations of power. Sorry about all the coughing. That's it. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you, Rebecca. Yeah, you can end screen if you like. Fab. I can see you all again now. Oh, you've got all the claps coming through. Thank you very much. Yeah, really interesting that you've taken us through the idea and the creative methods and arts-based methodology and that role in participation with young people and youth activism in general. And also actually for your honesty about the challenges in undertaking this research. My kind of initial comment or question was going to be that obviously you spoke about the struggles of institutions acknowledging how important arts-based and participatory research is, but how are you managing to ensure accountability to the people, the participants that have been involved in your research, and about this knowledge and mobilization that you speak about? How do you manage to overcome those challenges then? This might be a question that we want to discuss with the other two speakers as well, or if they'd like to join in, they're more than welcome to at this point. If there's any more comments to add to that, or Rebecca, you can throw us into the big question there.
Well, I suspect that the other speakers may be talking about some of this when they have the floor as well. But maybe I can just use one example to maybe actually illustrate how tricky these things are. So I was involved in a research project with Shauna Pomerantz, like we called it our Smart Girls Project. And we were, we did interviews and often follow-up interviews as well with mostly girls, but some boys in high school who identified as sort of highly academic achieving. And we were talking to them about gender and sort of how they were negotiating gender. And I was, and we were sort of talking about like the importance of involving participants in talking about the data analysis to some extent. This was not a participatory project. This was more of an interactive project. But we did decide to have a day where we invited participants to come to the university and to listen to some of the observations that we'd been making and to get feedback from them on those observations. And ultimately it was hard, and it was kind of disappointing, and maybe shaped some of my thinking about this kind of thing, because I mean, we'd had incredibly rich and interesting conversations with many people, and there is a role there for the researcher then, like many busy people who I do not think would have wanted to roll up their sleeves and get down to doing the quantity of work that was involved in doing the analysis of what we had been hearing about from them. Like even getting sometimes a second interview was really tough. So then when we presented we presented some of our sort of main observations, right, which of course had a gendered component to them, because that was our focus, was gender. And, you know, and the number of participants who came to that event was small. And most of them, what they commented on was their own personal experience, right? So they'd say, well, for me, I didn't really feel like there was discrimination because I was a girl, for example. And I was like, okay, that's important to recognize their individual experiences. However, one of our observations was that often the girls said that they didn't experience discrimination, but that then all of these little examples came up in the various interview components that suggested that they did. And so, but then even when we sort of said that back to them, they were like reverting back to their individual experience, which makes tons of sense because they hadn't had this breadth of exposure and they weren't, you know, dedicating their sort of many hours that we'd been dedicating to really sort of thinking about analyzing what was happening to girls in school. So what's the point of all that? It's to say that this is not to say that all participatory projects are problematic or that we couldn't have done this project in a more participatory way. Maybe we could have, but for the project that we were doing and the way that we were doing it, it felt not entirely possible, and it felt like engaging and consulting was maybe it felt tokenistic, right? And it felt problematic, and it felt that it wasn't recognizing by sort of going back and saying to this smaller group, this is what we found, and some of them saying, well, that doesn't match my experience, then it sort of felt like it kind of undermined what we had brought to the project. I mean, I wouldn't mind hearing it from other people about sort of how they've reflected on that kind of a part of a project or a process, but it did give me pause, where I do feel like we need to recognize that we also bring skills to the floor, and that sometimes the young people that we do research with aren't in the same places that we are in terms of thinking about the data. Does that,
Yeah, no, thank you, Rebecca. And maybe that's a point we can bring up in the discussion after we hear from all the speakers about our role as researchers and the value, but also how we can both work side by side each other to create that best outcome for the group that we're working with. So actually, I'm going to fly straight into asking Lorraine to share the screen. I'm just aware of our time. Lorraine, I will try and give you a wave, but you may not be able to see me, so I might have to butt in and unmute myself if that's okay. I think it's quite a little bit more difficult to do this online, even though we should be used to it. So Lorraine, as you share your screen for us. So Professor Lorraine van Blerk is going to present a different aspect of participatory methods in research, but particularly with street children and youth. And actually, you've got it on the screen there. So Lorraine, would you like to fire away, please? Thank you.
Sure. Can I just check that you can just see the one screen? You can't see. You can just see the main slide. Okay. Thanks.
Yeah,
okay, thank you, Nia, and thanks, Rebecca, for your talk as well. I think it very neatly sets the scene, and I think I'm going to pick up on some of the things that you talk about as well. So the title of my talk is Creating Stories for Impact and Activism, Co-producing Knowledge Through Story Mapping. And Nia, do feel free to interrupt me at that 15-minute mark. The production of knowledge for impact has been widely debated within my discipline of geography and across the social sciences for those working with groups experiencing exclusion. And I think recently this discussion has moved on beyond the need to involve participants directly in research in the way that Rebecca was talking about, but also to think about how they're involved and whether their voices are accurately represented in subsequent outputs, dissemination, knowledge exchange. And I think this is particularly true for those working with young people, and where representations of childhood and rights-based ethical dilemmas of protection versus participation can raise those tensions around the nature of how we engage in participation and the process that we go through to ensure that we're doing things appropriately. And so I think even within childhood studies, the knowledge, the co-production of knowledge within that discipline or area is always embedded in this language of participation. So focusing on inclusivity and authenticity for enabling young people's voices to be heard requires us to go beyond the inequalities of power inherent in those research relationships. And this means that research with young people is often now framed within an ethos of co-production, going beyond participation for the importance of learning from young people, hearing their voices and overcoming those adult-youth power disparities. But of course, the reification of young people's true voice has also been questioned and critiqued alongside the assumptions of autonomy, indicating that adult researchers still exert some control in participatory projects, shaping the inputs and the outcomes. And so we've sought to challenge some of these through this particular paper, which is already published in a journal called Area, by looking at creating stories for impact and activism. The paper itself discusses the process of engaging in a story map process with young people and the outcomes for policy and practice. And I want to highlight that these story maps can be part of this expanded toolkit of participatory methodologies in the vein of the arts-based approaches that Rebecca mentioned, but also enabling young people to construct messages for global audiences that transcend space and time, and offering ways to facilitate youth-led activist knowledge exchange and impact through research. So I'll start just with a little bit about what story maps are in case people are not aware. Then I'll just briefly mention the research projects that were involved in this paper, what we mean by co-production and the story mapping process, and then give you some of the benefits of this particular methodology or method, the challenges that we faced and how we overcame those, and conclusion. I hope that's moved on. I'm just believing it has, and somebody will tell me if
we can see it.
Okay, so story maps are interactive web applications, and we use Esri ArcGIS story map software. And this enables us to combine text, videos, sounds, photography and maps as well to enliven research findings and influence policy and public audiences beyond the academy. And also with it being digital content that we're creating here, by going through that analysis process and creating the content also offers an opportunity for young people to reflect on the issues that they're representing and how they go about doing that. Packard and Dimitris also used online story mapping applications to research refugee life stories, and they note that these offer the possibility of illustrating multiple stories and creating the maps collaboratively, so working together with a variety of tools and formats can also help to stimulate young people's creativity and inspire them to provide themes and narratives and to highlight what it is that they want to share. And this offers a variety of perspectives as young people need to bring together different media approaches to narrate the storylines that they want to get across to wider publics and audiences. So the paper draws on two research projects sharing a similar co-production philosophy. Both were engaged with youth living in contexts of exclusion, poverty, displacement, crisis, where their life experiences were difficult and prevented them from engaging in kind of wider issues often. So there were the Growing Up on the Streets project, which is a longitudinal research project in Ghana, Zimbabwe and DRC, working with homeless young people on the streets, and the Youth Transitions and Protracted Crises project, which worked with young refugees in Uganda and Jordan. Growing up on the streets, I just briefly introduce these projects, and if anybody has questions about them later, I can pick that up. But Growing Up on the Streets was a longitudinal research project. As I said, it worked in those 3 cities with between 200 core young people and up to 500 young people aged between 14 and 20 at the start of the research. It was a 3-year data collection phase in the research, and we worked with 6 young researchers in each of those cities who undertook their own ethnographies with their peer groups. They were all homeless young people living on the streets who were doing the research for this project. And we explored their research through ethnography, and we have a large data set of those narratives, but we also produced these 3 story maps as part of the outputs from that research, 1 for each city. In Ghana, looking at capabilities on the streets of Accra. In Zimbabwe, looking at the impact of COVID-19 on lockdown on youth in Harare. And in Bukavu, looking at health and street life in Bukavu. And that one's also available in French, in case that's of interest to anybody. But the 3 of those story maps are all available. The Youth Transitions and Protracted Crises project was a shorter project funded by the UK government, looking at understanding the transition experiences for young people growing up in protracted crises as refugees. And this worked in camp and urban settlements in Uganda and Jordan, and again used a co-production philosophy and involved young people as researchers, co-researchers in the project, and they were all refugees in those settings. And we produced a story map for that, which was really exploring the different aspects of youth transition, so including kind of issues around education, livelihoods, relationships, growing up experiences, and discrimination related to that. And so the different chapters of that story map focus on the diversity of experiences there. So in seeking to extend debates regarding co-produced research, we accept that while participatory language is used, it can often obscure less than participatory actions. And I think that's what Rebecca was kind of alluding to in her comment at the end there. You know, we have this altruistic aim. We want to empower young people through a research process for some form of transformational impact in practice, policy, and public attitudes. But does that actually come through? So acknowledging that there can be inadequacies in participatory approaches with young people, I'm mindful of the need to embed their involvement at all stages of a research process, from designing research through to actioning their feedback, listening to their thoughts on outcomes. We argue that participatory engagement is vital for highlighting young people's capacities and expertise while creating opportunities for them to engage on a more equal platform. Kay Tisdall notes the importance of going beyond participation through co-production to challenge issues of power that are often the basis of critiques in research with young people. And rather than focus on young people's vulnerable situations, which in our case was around homelessness and refugee status, researchers should be looking to understand and highlight the constructural constraints and contexts that impact young people when co-creating those solutions. And facilitating participation through co-production can enable young people to create research and analysis and engage not only their own voices, but the voices of their peers in their contexts. So often research findings are disseminated in ways that don't leave this lasting legacy, and they don't often enable impact to occur beyond the bounds of the academy or professional practice. We produce policy materials, we have high-level discussions with stakeholders, produce academic publications, which we are having to produce within our institutions. And so we need to work with young people so that they can also become part of that impact legacy. And that's where we need alternative approaches to enable equity for young people as co-producers of knowledge exchange and impact beyond those local confines of the spaces and temporalities that they exist within, to have longer lasting, global, long-term, and in our case, digital impact. So the research process that are designed to include a number of potential contributors to co-production of knowledge need to recognise the different forms of impact that can be generated. And this can take place at different levels. I've highlighted an individual level, a policy level, and an international or global society level here. At the individual level, knowledge co-production provides space for young people to reflect together, to build confidence and strengthen efficacy for decision-making and action. At policy level, impact can be achieved when their viewpoints and their needs are included to improve systems of protection and support, where research leads to new information and understanding, and it can help to provide the basis for more inclusive and deliberative policy formation. And then at this international or societal level, looking beyond the academy, the co-production of knowledge provides a broader frame and potential for impact on societal norms and behaviours, shaping global publics' knowledge and behaviour, basically. So in relation to one of our story maps, Betty Ackel, who took part in the Accra story map, reflects on this in relation to this policy and international impact. And he states, the story map will improve the image of street children. We're not as bad as you think. We're living in harsh conditions, but we're just trying to make a living. So for him, creating the content opened his eyes to how he could share his experiences more widely, how he could get his message out. And in turn, our eyes can be opened by the stories and he and others created and shared through these digital story maps, because they can go beyond the academy and they can go beyond spaces of local policy workshops to new spaces where young people can be heard on a much broader scale. So what do they do to create these story maps? Well, young people work together, so young participants and young researchers working together to plan their research and to convey their story on a particular theme. And the topics included a whole variety of things across the projects around education, identities, discrimination, livelihoods, shelter, violence, a whole host of different aspects, COVID lockdown even. And then the young researchers and their peers conducted and collected all the materials that they took from their analysis. So interviews with each other, photographs, storyboards, drawings, going out onto the streets to make videos, all sorts of created content. And this kind of range of diverse techniques enables participants to express and illustrate the unique story that they want to get across in a creative and a personal way, although not necessarily an individual way. They can share biographical stories of displacement or street life, and these can be co-created to present messages that they want to share through their story maps. And so the diverse forms of planning and representing these stories meant that the findings could be collated from a number of participants to create vignettes that were personal, but also reached the heart of their experiences, but not necessarily specific to any one individual. So they were biographical, but collective, unique, but not attributed to anybody in particular, at the same time using emotive experiences to construct those lived realities. And although the story map content was created entirely between young researchers and participants, the creative process was undertaken with the support of a researcher to help put this onto the digital platform. And so each story map builds up the elements of the narrative and into an integrated package through the use of the software. And then this can be shared widely. There's a number of templates that can be chosen to put the work together to create something that's both visually attractive and interactive. and then they can be made available to access for knowledge exchange for young people to share their ideas. So in terms of the benefits of this work for youth-led impact and activism, these kind of story maps help to bring to life the stakeholder report that often doesn't get read. It's often long and put on a shelf. It can also help to take young people's stories, as I said, beyond their own localities. So it can be used, we use them in workshops globally in the UK. We also, because they're online, they were picked up by a number of platforms that resulted in articles talking about and promoting the story maps. So through the conversation, environment and urbanization. We even had a podcast for the Conversation Africa because they got in touch with us. And I'm actually doing another podcast for Nature in a few days' time based on the process of these story maps and how it resulted in young people being awarded an award through something called the Hidden Ref, but it probably means nothing to any of you outside of the UK. The story maps are also used as an educational resource. In teaching, they've also been put on websites hosted by our NGO partners and been picked up for international policy. So, for example, the refugee story map has been included in the UNICEF and Norwegian Refugee Council Interagency Standing Committee guidelines on the Compact for Young People in Humanitarian Crises in terms of good practice for the co-production of knowledge. And of course, for transforming participants and stakeholders, really understanding from a personal perspective the impacts of the story map on stakeholders' lives in order to help shape and change the way in which practice takes place. But of course, as Rebecca also alluded, there's some challenges around this, and I'll just very quickly highlight 4 of those. First of all, around the process of co-production. It's not easy when you're working with diverse groups of young people in terms of how they want to engage with material, but I think story maps enables us to be flexible. Although there can be a central focus to the message, they were able to use many different forms of media to engage in the process. And then obviously in any kind of research that can be emotional, there's potential for distress. And in the same way that you would with other participatory research, engaging in training and working with stakeholders to support that. But our youth researchers talked about how that was an important part of the process. Ethical issues also come up as particularly important, and making sure that no harm would come, particularly when you're engaging with digital content, with photographs and videos and those sorts of things. And we had to do very careful training around that. And the last point here is around access to the technology. One of the things that we hoped at the start of using this technology was that young people could be involved in engaging with the technology. And so far, we didn't quite manage to make that happen due to internet and site licenses and things. But I think there's potential for that to happen. And so just to conclude then, we think that story mapping is a useful way to engage in knowledge exchange because it can be tailored to young people's needs and it can help to influence policy and publics beyond the kind of confines of a local setting of a research project. And so it does provide a way in which we can see the ripple effects of young people's work going much more broadly, but that means there's an onus on researchers to then maintain contact with young people in a research project to feed that back to them, to let them know what's happened and how far their messages have reached. So story mapping provides an excellent opportunity to meaningfully engage young people in analysis, knowledge exchange and impact beyond the temporal and spatial limits of research projects. Thank you very much. And back to you, Nia.
Excellent. Thank you, Lorraine. Yeah, just fascinating to see how through the co-produced projects, both of them, how this digital participatory form of story mapping has developed, and actually already the impact it's had both for the people involved and their stories being heard at this wider level already. I personally wanted to hear a little bit more about how the young persons, the young participants and the young researchers dynamic worked out and things, but I'm aware of the time. But thank you very much, Lorraine, and maybe that's something we can touch upon a little bit later. And this hidden ref, I'd like to hear about that as well. The hidden ref, for those, yeah, a bit more relevant for us over here in the UK. But are you okay to just take it off the screen for us, Lorraine?
I thought I had. Right. Okay, let me. I thought I had done it, and now I don't have. Oh, wait a minute.
If you go to the bottom.
Maybe I need to leave and rejoin or something. I don't know how to do that. I've only got a little sidebar of the video. Sorry, this is the process of not.
Perfect.
Oh,
great.
Nearly did it. Somebody else did it for me. Thank you, whoever that was.
I think that was Sian, thank you. Perfect. So Alex, just would you like to share your screen for us? And I'll just, yeah, this is Professor Alex Khasnabish, who's going to delve into the possibilities and the limitations of activist ethnography. So plenty to learn again from our final speaker, not last but not least. So Alex, I'll give you a wave at the 15 and then we'll have delve into discussion after. So fire away, John.
Okay,
Alex, thank you.
Thanks so much.
Would
Thanks
you like
everyone.
to share your screen fully because we can
Oh,
see?
sure.
On there. Yeah.
Sorry, just 1 second.
No, that's great.
Let me do this. And...
And just for a reminder of everybody on the screen, please put any comments or questions you may have in the chat box and we'll try and get to them at the very end. Thank you.
So thank you, first of all, for the invitation to be here. It's a real pleasure. Thanks to the organizers for putting this together and inviting me. I'm really happy to be in this company speaking about these issues. So my name is Alex Khasnabish. I'm a professor at Mount Saint Vincent University in Halifax, Nova Scotia. That's on the unceded, unsurrendered territories of the Mi'kmaq people. And as a settler on these territories, I want to acknowledge my responsibility and our collective responsibility to decolonize our lives and our presences here and to learn to live with justice and dignity with the first inhabitants of these territories. I also want to preface my talk, which I've entitled Humble Contributions, Honest Accounts, as maybe a compliment, I think, to the two excellent presentations that we just heard. I'm going to speak a little bit less about specific projects and a little bit more generally. I'm also going to talk a little bit less specifically about youth and more about research in a participatory mode. And my focus is specifically on activism and social movements. It's the work that I've done for a long time now, and it's involved lots of youth participation, but rarely have any of my projects sort of prioritized youth as a constituency. So a lot of my reflections certainly have to do with them, but more of them have to do with activism and research, and even more of them maybe have to do with you know, generating what we might think of as intergenerational conversations. So the first thing I just wanted to put out there was the relationship, or to problematize the relationship between scholarship and activism. And I'm an anthropologist by training. I teach in a combined department, sociology and anthropology, and I'm if you were to force me to choose, I am a social movements scholar by training and by choice. And so I came of age in an anthropological generation that was wrestling with questions of power and representation. where the so-called crisis of representation of the 1980s had really lit a fire under many anthropologists. And I would suggest at the same time, there was this, incursion into sociology and social science broadly that was really demanding that researchers and our institutions live up to some of the promise that they had been putting forth through research and through scholarship up to that point, and deliver the goods on actually promoting, contributing to social justice and social change, doing a better job of authentically representing the voices and perspectives of people who are being engaged in research, and accounting for the often unjust and unearned power differentials and relationships that exist between researchers and our participants so often. And I think most of this really inspired me, incredibly shaped my growth as a budding academic and junior scholar. And I brought a lot of that into my my research and my commitments in ways that I love and continue to appreciate. But I think over the last 5 years, as my work in one phase of my academic life, as the Radical Imagination Project wrapped up and I moved on to other things, I also began to think pretty hard about the relationship between scholarship and activism, and to problematize it a little bit. So for the sake of brevity, I'm going to gloss over some of these points, and I hope if they're interesting, we can pick up on them in discussion. I think they resonate with a lot that's been said already. So the first point I want to throw out there is, while scholar activist tends to be a term that's celebrated now and not used as a slur, which I'm glad of, I think there's a lot of work to be done around really interrogating what scholar activism means, or scholarly activism, activist scholarship, where that hyphen falls, in what order we put those terms. And I think, strangely enough, given my history, the problematization I'd like to do of this term right now is with regard to what I see as a fairly slippery slope in recent times that has led to a valorization of the activist side of that equation and a diminishment of the scholarship. And what has led, I think, to some problematic formulations around what research is, what it does, and what it should be doing. So one question that, that I used to believe the unreserved answer to was yes, is should we all be a scholar activist? And I actually think that's perhaps that's obvious to most of you, that the answer is no, of course not. There should be lots of room in the modern academy, certainly in knowledge production circles, that celebrates alternative modes of being, researching, and doing. But the conviction that we should all be working towards social justice and social change has become, at least rhetorically, a powerful plank in most of our institutions. Most of us, I suspect, work at universities or post-secondary educational institutions which proclaim some sort of affiliation to social justice, which for me is, pretty ironic in an era where our institutions have never been more austere, have thoroughly been steeped in the cultural and capitalist logic of neoliberalism, and actually are, despite the protestations of many social science and liberal arts faculty, are actually dominant and key institutions in the replication of modern power and relations of ruling in our societies. So I think, some of this I'm pointing out, I see it as a bit disingenuous, not on the part of individual faculty, but on the part of our institutions and how branding and marketing works. But also in terms of what the colonization of what is identified as activist work by professional and scholarly vocations, individuals, and institutions, what that means, and the kinds of contradictions and problems that creates. So one thing I think is really wonderful about the label of scholar activist and the conversations around it we've had in recent decades is that it recognizes that research was and is and always has been political. So, you know, I'm not going to delve into the well-worn debates around objectivity and neutrality in research. I assume that we're all well versed in them, and that's you know, effectively been debunked as sort of a real position to occupy. We all know we are complex social subjects coming to research, not blank slates, and it's all to the good that we are acknowledging those perspectives, those positionalities, those power relationships. So that's something that's very positive that's come out of that. I think scholar activism also, as other presenters have talked about today, has very deep roots, that it's nothing new despite the novelty of some of the discourses around it. And in fact, if we look back to the roots of participatory action research or feminist research, or indeed the roots of sociology, in so many ways, we see figures trying to achieve some modicum of social justice and social change through scholarly research. So this is hardly something new, and that's also important to recognize. I think at the same time, we've seen in recent decades a shift from margins. Certainly when I was in grad school in the 1990s, we've seen a shift from a fairly marginal role for a lot of activist research into a much more central mode. It's something, again, that has become, in my most cynical mode, a branding opportunity for universities increasingly desperate to show their real world applicability. There are contributions outside of the arid terrain of scholarly discourse. But I also think it has problems in terms of becoming a new dominant kind of hegemonic logic for what scholars, especially in social science, are supposed to be doing with their time. So what are some of the upsides to it? To this focus on scholar activism, this promotion of social justice or social change work through research. First of all, it certainly has, in the first two presentations, I think wonderfully highlighted this. It's encouraged community engagement and a real focus on grassroots knowledge production. That was always going on, right? This is, I think, one of the really important truths that's been recognized by scholars working in this mode, that grassroots people outside of the academy have always been producing their own knowledge, whether or not it's been acknowledged by people with credentials, and that the work that most of us have done as qualitative researchers has been not about creating that knowledge, but about, at best, mobilizing it, focusing it, bringing it into conversation with other knowledge discourses, and maybe at worst, it's been going in, misrepresenting it, commodifying it, branding it, sequestering it, conscripting it for our own purposes and our own academic capital accumulation. And so I think, you know, both those are two extreme poles, and there are lots of examples in between. But it's done those things, right? It's put the university, and I think this is one of my, you know, my favorite points to make. It's put the university and its resources to work for grassroots struggles for social change and social justice in a way that historically didn't happen. I think when when scholars went out, especially in social movement studies, to study people organizing for change at the grassroots and non-institutionally. And again, it's recognized the false principle of neutrality in terms of your orientation to the world as an illusion. And I think it's led to more fruitful discussions around our role as subjects, as knowledge producers, as teachers, as community members in these in the work that we do and in the resources we mobilize around that. So how about the downside? Well, there are lots of downsides, and I think actually one of my contemporary frustrations is that they get talked about a lot less than some of the upsides, which is, again, an interesting and ironic reversal from the skepticism with which much of this was greeted before. So the downside, just a few points here. Again, to this sort of celebration and veneration of scholar activism, activist scholarship. One is a tendency to study issues we're personally invested in and movements we like. And in social movement studies, this is a truth I take very closely to heart. It's reflected in the preponderance of scholarship we have about so-called progressive or social justice oriented movements, compared to the scholarship we have about movements that are seen as reactionary, authoritarian, violent, or dangerous in some way. But it even extends to broader categories like radical, so researchers will often end up going to work in settings which are familiar to them, which are friendly to them, which resonate with them. And I've been guilty of this. I put myself squarely in this group for a long time. I studied with and amongst movements and activists who I had personal and political affinity. And I saw my work as an extension of that impulse for social change and collective liberation. I still do to some extent, but I think my perspective on that is a little bit more nuanced now. So the problem with this, of course, is not that those movements aren't worth studying. It's that what do we end up not knowing as a result of our focus on issues that we feel are important and constituencies that we tend to relate to? What do we end up not knowing about? And yeah, I won't go off on a tangent there. I'll save that for later, actually. It also, and I think this is something that gets talked about a lot less. So that problem actually gets discussed fairly well in social movement studies, especially. There's a good and healthy debate around that question of who are we looking at, what don't we know? And how do our personal and political orientations bring us to that? But it also centers in a very professional managerial class moment, a very white collar work ethic. It centers career as activism and the university as an institution in social change struggles, which I actually believe has a deleterious effect on activism itself by bringing it back onto university campuses, by celebrating and focusing on the role of scholarship and knowledge production and university-based learning as pathways to social change, which I actually think deserves a good deal of scrutiny rather than our rhetorical celebration of those things. And again, I think one of the biggest problems is it's a bit of an obnoxious conceit that what we're doing through our work is actually activism, and this carries real political consequences for the people who are learning from us, from the models we're establishing as pathways to social change. It's I see it not only, but as one plank of a kind of technocratic approach to social change, actually, which again has the unintentional effect of valorizing experts and expert knowledge. Even while we talk about the democratic and grassroots potential of this work, it recenters the university in that way. And finally, I think the one downside I want to point out here, and this is a troubling trend I've seen more recently, and fairly anecdotally in my work as a peer reviewer, as a mentor for graduate students and undergraduates, but also as somebody who just tends to float in these circles, I think this can sometimes be an alibi for bad research, frankly. And what ends up happening is that in many cases, researchers who, with the best of intentions, end up going to work with movements they like and that they want to see succeed, end up producing scholarship that looks more like cheerleading, and in some cases propaganda, than it does critical reflection on those movements that is useful to those movements themselves. And I think this is actually a significant departure from the work of earlier scholar activists who were very committed to struggles for collective liberation, but also wanted to see or were very adamant about the fact that their role was something other than simply being an activist amongst others in those movements. So just to be really clear about the terms that we're grappling with here, when I'm talking about ethnography, I'm talking about a qualitative research methodology that involves an in-depth research orientation in the field, wherever that field is, that conveys a sense of being there, right? Obviously, historically, in disciplines like anthropology, it was long-term, in-depth, very focused. That isn't necessarily true anymore, but it comprises methods like participant observation, interviews, focus groups, and a wide variety of other specific methods. What about social movements? Well, we're talking about organized collectives engaged in a common project, right? They have a conflictual orientation, towards society, towards the status quo, and they're engaged in conflictual forms of action. They're connected through dense informal networks of communication, and they form distinctive collective identities. So why do I point those two things out? Well, I point those two things out essentially to draw attention to the fact that I think those things are a lot easier to achieve when we think about doing that kind of work with those kind of phenomena in contexts where we think we are friendly towards the social demographic that makes up those constituencies, where those social and political contexts are not hostile to us in our individual identities or as researchers in general. We are drawn to do work that we think is going to be involved in assisting social uplift or producing change that we think we need to see or that we want to see. And that's all to the good. That's really important. But on the other hand, I'm going to come back to that other point. What happens when these are movements we don't like? So right now we're seeing a global resurgence of far-right movements, the birth arguably of a new right-wing populism. And one of the things that I think is desperately missing from this conversation is in-depth research that doesn't aim to platform or excuse or provide an alibi for any of these iterations, but that takes them seriously and actually puts the tools of qualitative research to work in those contexts. The fact that that is more rare is certainly a consequence of those contexts being harder to crack in terms of their social location, their openness compared to more progressive or left-wing movements. But it's also an indication of our unwillingness as researchers to go there often for fear of being seen to legitimate those struggles. So that's an issue.
2 minutes.
Okay, thanks. I'm almost done. Sort of by way of arriving at a conclusion for some of these preliminary thoughts, I wanted to identify 3 broad strategies that my collaborator, partner in crime, Max Haven, and I identified in our work in the Radical Imagination Project, which we ran over almost a decade in Halifax. And we talked in that project about 3 different orientations to social movement research and scholar activism. And one is invocation, and this is kind of the classic one that's happened in much politically engaged social movement research. So this is where researchers go to work deploying their academic credentials and expertise essentially to legitimate non-institutional political struggles and social movements. So this is sort of the most conventional, but the most politically engaged, familiar approach to social movements in the academy when researchers decide to be open about their political commitments. And we think that has value, that's important. It's certainly work to legitimate politics by other means. The second strategy is avocation. And this is where researchers actually disavow their academic credentials and standing what they regard as unjust power relations and disappear effectively into movements as another participant, putting their skills to work within movements themselves, but really at the direction of those movements and those activists. And the third strategy that we tried to develop through the Radical Imagination Project and in projects since, something we call convocation, which is actually not disavowing that weird, unjust autonomy provided to researchers who are connected to the academy, to the university, but trying to put it to work alongside of activists and movements to bring, to call, to summon something into being that wasn't there before. And none of those strategies are bad. All of them are imperfect. They all have their pitfalls and their blind spots. But I think making the case for a convocation-based approach is what we have tried to do over the past few years, with the following caveats. I think what I want to do is simply make the case for us having producing honest accounts and being content with making humble contributions to a more just, more liberated society. So and I just really want to leave the panel and all of you with some questions here that maybe we can take up in the discussion. So what can we contribute to our participants, students, colleagues, comrades, institutions, and communities as researchers who are engaged with political phenomena? I think that's a hard question to answer. I think it sounds rhetorical, but I ask it honestly, like, what do we imagine ourselves contributing today, given the kind of plethora of media and informational sources around us that are also competing for people's time and attention? How can we avoid turning movements into ATMs for the generation of academic capital, right? And sort of like accumulating that capital on the backs of movements and activists and those in struggle? How can we resist the lure of collapsing work, status, and political identity, especially for those of us who have secure positions within the academy with all the repercussions that come out of that? How can we avoid cheerleading and accounts that are dishonest because we over-identify with our research participants and don't wish to air dirty laundry in public, but then end up abdicating the role of social critic, which we sometimes have to occupy? And then finally, just to return to that first point, maybe, what is social research good for now? Given that we occupy such a crowded field where there's so much meaning and information being contested, how can we make these theories more meaningful, more resonant? What do we imagine ourselves doing in this space? And the two previous presenters already spoke quite persuasively to that. So I'll stop there. Thanks for your time and attention. Again, thanks for the opportunity to be here. I look forward to some discussion.
Thank you, Alex. That was brilliant, and for actually starting the conversation for us to start questioning ourselves and the way that we do research, and those final few questions for us all to take home as well. So thank you. I'm going to fly straight into questions because we've had a flurry of them from our participants and our lovely attendees. If those of you that have already put them in the chat box want to put your hands up and ask those questions, or I can read them out. Adel, you've got a few questions here, and we've also got some further up. So our first question, I'll fly straight in. I think this was to Rebecca. Is going through the TCPS2 good enough as a foundation?
I'm presuming that this is a comment in regards to what I was, or a question about what I was saying about REBs, and which are research ethics boards here in Canada. And in Canada, we're governed by the TCPS2, and in that there's been a lot more recognition of the importance of hearing children and children's voices, and a lot more openness towards sort of diversity of research approaches. So I'm assuming that that's where the question is coming from. And I would say, yes, for sure, it's made a huge difference for faculty and students being able to advocate for the kinds of projects that they want to do that are more participatory or arts-based, or a little bit more unpredictable, and also working with children. But I do know from my own experience working with some different, several different university research ethics boards, that not everybody maybe is as comfortable being open to these diversities of approaches as others. And so researchers have had to use the TCPS2 to advocate for their projects and sort of fight back. And it's just really frustrating when the research process, you get sort of really bogged down there. And I know that then creates this ripple effect where certainly students at my own university, which is frankly actually at Brock, the REB is really great around these issues overall. But what happens is these stories sort of percolate out into the world. And I know that students in my own program, for example, have said, well, I'm not going to do any research with children at all because of the REB. And then my response is always, well, you can do it. And there's all sorts of ways. And I've gotten through that process many times and done really cool research through doing that. But there's a feeling out there, and I think because of some specific instances of challenge where people are prevented in their heads already from trying out really important and exciting kinds of projects. And I know this one other university that I had to deal with was really, really challenging on this front.
Can I just add something to that? because I've had really recent experience scanning the TCPS for information about participatory research. And it mentions it once as an example of qualitative research. And, you know, even the section on qualitative research is only about that big. So absolutely everything Rebecca said, and I've been in that chair of trying to advocate, educate the REB on how to respond to participatory research with young people, with marginalized young people, homeless young people. But I've also lately been on the other side of needing to defend myself against the REB and having to look through the TCPS to see what kinds of guidance it provides around participatory research, which is really none. And so this is a tricky thing. And I've had a very complex issue at my university because the TCPS doesn't include, and REBs don't know how to handle this category of participant researchers. And Lorraine and I have had a good discussion about this lately, actually, and co-researchers, or or having young people engaged in knowledge mobilization who are vulnerable, even though they're not part of the research. But do they then need to be covered by the REB? So there's a lot of work actually that needs to happen, I think, in Canada, and I'm sure elsewhere, to elaborate on what is meant, both to protect the participants and also to protect researchers from sometimes overzealous ethics committees who might see things differently. Just felt important to add that because of recent painful experience.
Yeah. Do either of the other two speakers want to come in on that? Or should we dive to the next question? I think the next question is from Victoria to Lorraine. How was the relationship between the youth researchers and the youth participants, and also why you choose youth researcher? How was the methodological discussion about it? Lots to cover.
Yeah, thanks, Victoria, for your questions. Maybe just one quick point on the last thing before I move to that. I think one of the other things is when you work outside of the country or the context in which your university or where you are based. So I'm working with colleagues in South Africa at the moment to involve young people in data analysis as a very specific small pilot project, and they approved the ethics through their IRB, and then they came back after they approved it with some other questions that they'd come up with later about I don't know, different things around authorship, things that were, and so now it's been held up again. And I think, the way my university sees ethics and the way it's seen in another context can be quite different as well, and particularly around the whole participation question. So it can be quite challenging to deal with. If I take growing up on the streets, because that was the biggest of the projects, probably the easiest one to kind of go through. So that worked with a large number of young people who were homeless on the streets. The data collection took place in 2013 to 2016, and it was a 10-year program of work. So I'm still very much in touch with the youth researchers across the 3 countries as well. So their relationship to the participants was very much their peers, and they were embedded within that. So all the young people who chose to engage in the research process as researchers, and it was opened out to anybody who wanted to participate in the training in the 3 cities. And so we engaged more young people in training around research than ended up taking up sort of part-time paid employment as researchers. And as I said, they did ethnography for 3 years. So they didn't change their context or their situation. I suppose the difference is they maybe had some regular income from the research, but they were very much living and working as they would have, as they were with the rest of their peers. Those peers were all very much part of the project as well. They had all consented to being in a research group, if you like, so being part of the ethnographic group. And they also engaged in focus group discussions, so their voices were included in the project as well. But so they were very much connected. It was part of their communities in which they were working and researching. And I think, you know, that's kind of interesting that you pick up on the terminology. And we had quite a bit of discussion around this. And it was a kind of important distinction to be part of that community. So to be part of the youth, the young people involved in the project, but equally to be seen as a researcher on the project, because, you know, they were undertaking their own research, and to sort of highlight those skills. And so that's why the term is not just researcher, for example. It was really important to those young people who were in really marginalized situations, extremely challenging sometimes contexts, and engaging with policymakers as well through knowledge exchange that ran across the project. You know, it was really important that they stood out and stood up as members of their own communities on the street. So it was kind of their choice, really. So I hope that answers that question.
Excellent. So co-production through and through, even in the language element. So I'm just going to move on to Alex. We have a question here. What do you mean when you say plank? And then the second part, that was then very interesting. Trio of strategies sounds like convocation is a combo of the other two.
Yeah, I think I used plank twice when I was talking. I think the first, I think I was talking about the kind of exhortation to be a proponent, or to be, you know, like a university leader in social justice, and the way that scholar activism has become built into this. So, I mean, really, I'm just talking about the way that the university as a neoliberal institution conscripts our best intentions sometimes. And I think not nefariously, this is no, like, you know, dark room filled with cigar smoking men looking at world domination, but nevertheless, I think it's like, to me, just right now, it's fascinating to look at the extent to which our institutions pay incredible lip service to things like inclusion and diversity, to equity, to social change and social justice. And yet, as a friend of mine loves to say, are an example of one of the few institutions that went from medievalism to neoliberalism without an intervening stage of industrialization, with all the work ethics and the relations that are a part of that. And this kind of, I don't know, this game that we tend to play as academics, right? As constantly kind of disavowing the importance of the centrality, or wondering why we're not more significant to sort of public policy discussions. But at the same time, the university has become an absolutely central institution through which more and more people are expected to pass and get credentialed. So I think those are, you know, those are tensions that are alive in our research too. And when we make commitments to being researchers who are at work to advance social justice or to advance collective liberation, what does that mean in the context of an institution that is deeply enmeshed in relations of ruling in our current societies? I don't think, like, I'm not saying that to be cynical or to be nihilistic. I think it's simply, that's a productive site to have a conversation around. But I remain frustrated, I think, and, you know, as somebody who's been around long enough now to see the proliferation of activist studies, what might be called kind of like an activist studies ethic, I think it's been conscripted by some of the most, like, liberal leaning elements in the university, rather than the more radical grassroots ones. So I think it's become a plank in that kind of hegemony, right, within the university. As for convocation, yeah, I think so. I think in many ways it is like a marriage between the two. And I would say it's totally imperfect as well. Like we've written at some length about the project and some of our frustrations with it. And I think, you know, that's just something I guess I would say that's interesting too, right, for us to reflect, not as a way of lamenting our failures, but simply as a way of critically sort of excavating the terrain on which we work, thinking about when we put the best of intentions into our projects, and yet they didn't mobilize knowledge. They didn't convoke that energy at the grassroots. They didn't stimulate people, young people, or intergenerationally to have greater agency in the society, because like they're just one element amongst a much bigger ecosystem that we are implicated in. But I take your point. I like the you know, the kind of aspirational note in the term convocation, but I'm not sure it lives up to its promise. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you, Alex. Has anybody else got any questions that haven't asked or would like to put their hand up before we have we've got another question here. You're more than welcome. You don't have to type it here. You can say it out loud as well. No, we're all eager, wanting to take in all the information. So we have one across the board for all three of our speakers. No worries. Thank you, Harriet. Good question to consider when we are afraid to engage in research in these tough areas, because despite our best efforts to do no harm, we might. And then they've given an example. If I try to answer Alex's final questions, I might be scared to proceed with research. So we need some inspiration here, panelists. We need to give some encouragement. Who would like to go first?
I mean, honestly, I'll jump in first if you don't mind, even though I just got to speak. I would say I hope none of this was meant to scare anyone at all. I think it's these are the questions that when I teach my qualitative methods course to, you know, my third year undergrads, that I like to put front and center, only because I think, you know, what we're engaged in doing, as we all, I think, agree, you know, it matters, and it can have really socially significant implications. And beyond that, it can help like return a sense of agency and empowerment to people who live in a society that regularly tries to deny them that, right? So I think research is incredibly important. In fact, I agree. I would only say that I think, you know, an institutional REB is incredibly important. They're not just hoops to jump through, but I hear everything that's been said today about the way that they can very subtly, sometimes and with the best of intentions, dissuade, defang, you know, disable research in ways that are incredibly limiting, and really, you know, mainly because they are risk management boards for the institutions that they serve, right? They want to make sure that, you know, the university doesn't end up in the crosshairs of a lawsuit that's going to deny it funding from all the relevant agencies going forward, in addition to the fact that researchers have done some pretty awful things to people in the past, and should think about that very carefully and be held to a high standard of account. But for me, like, my current research focuses on the far right, authoritarian right fascists. And I think that's an important work. I think journalists get to do this kind of work all the time with far lower barriers. And I think unless we grapple better with how to, I think, really instill a truly ethical comportment into every budding researcher in ways that aren't so technocratic, again, you know, not just doing the TCPS2 core tutorial, not just demonstrating knowledge of like official policies, not just having a really good consent form, but also like demonstrating through your entire sort of research orientation that you are, you know, you are putting front of mind the dignity, autonomy, and humanity of your subjects, but also that you're doing work that matters and that is transparent and rigorous and can't always be entirely 100% safe, either for you or for your participants. Like, you may dredge up something for people in the context of an interview you never expected. You may expose people to some level of scrutiny that you never intended and couldn't anticipate. And I don't think those are not reasons not to engage the world, right? I think if anything, we see all sorts of examples with the proliferation of misinformation, disinformation, intentional attempts to mobilize people in the pursuit of all kinds of awful causes today. We've never lived in a time where good, thoughtful, grassroots, meaningful information mattered more, and bringing that to people and helping them like wrestle with it, mobilize it, is incredibly important. And I hope people who have a passion for doing that and want to work as researchers do that. Like, don't be scared off by it. But, you know, like, it's never done, right? This is not it's not a hurdle to cross. It's kind of a process, like informed consent, right? That's just ongoing forever. Thanks.
Yeah, some great points there made. And already, just a note to say, you've already turned up here. You're already thinking wider than just yourself and those worries. You're already turning up to things that may really well help you and set you on that journey, and listening to all these amazing scholars here and learning from their mistakes as well, or their challenges. So Jackie's got a hand up. Come in, yeah.
Okay, unless, would any of the other panelists like to respond to Adel's question? Because I was going to move on to a different question. Or
okay, Lorraine, Rebecca.
I think I'd just say really quickly, well said, Alex. I mean, I think, you know, that was a perfect answer to the question. But also, I think, you know, we should be pushing back against practices that don't seek to engage in these social justice agendas, and particularly around IRB and ethics boards as well. With a different team, I recently published a paper in qualitative research looking at social harm in relation to these ethical hoops that we have to jump through working in Malawi, where going through the IRB process there was actually completely antithetical to our ethical standpoint in engaging in really poor communities. And so we're pushing back on that process, because it's really important for us as academics to stand up and make change to support the populations that we're working with. And yeah, you know, they are there to ensure that research is done ethically, but we also have to look at those as well. And through our engagement in research and working with communities, we can push back on things that actively will harm communities and participants just because of processes that are outdated and don't consider the realities on the ground. So we should also be using our academic positions and voices to do that too.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, thank you. I'm just aware of the time and our flurry of questions and discussion. I thank you for hanging on in with us. Jackie, would you like to just come in with your final point, and maybe if speakers are happy for some questions via email, if this does continue, that would be great. I'm not doing a very good job if I let this go on too long.
You're doing a great job. I think we're scheduled for 2 hours. Am I wrong? Was it supposed to be an hour and a half?
An hour and a half. Yeah.
Oh, oops. Okay, we're over. Well, okay. I'll just throw cat hair all over the place. I got a cat in my lap. He always sneaks on when I'm on Zoom. So I want to maybe just throw out, maybe it's more of a thought for consideration than a question, since we're running out of time. Which is, it's kind of directed at Alex's remarks, which were very, very interesting, very, you know, provocative and thought-provoking in good ways. And perhaps I want to invite Lorraine into thinking with me, and Rebecca as well, but because I feel as if, Alex, you're speaking somewhat to a bit of a Canadian culture of activism that has an idea around, and so really what I want to kind of leave our panel with is to think about both, and you're referencing this in relation to the university, but also the political economy of activism, of who gets to be an activist and what kinds of resources are required. What is the history of the nation state in which that happens? And in Canada, you know, it's a liberal democratic so-called settler colonial state with particular dynamics of inequality that have allowed some people to gain the post-secondary education that actually is pretty much required to engage in activist practices. Whether that's right or wrong, that is, I argue in my work, the context that we live in. And I think there's a similar context that plays out in the UK, and I say that from having researched with young activists in the UK, but maybe less so in other places, and Shihan could probably speak to this because he's interviewed young activists in other European countries anyways, so I guess what I want to leave us with, and I think this is true of all of the topics, right, is that kind of deep consideration of the history and political economy and the sort of pre-existing governmentality that has shaped the different sets of individuals who then participate in, whether it's activism or research, or, you know, because I think there's also, and I feel like Rebecca, you're referencing this too, a kind of valorization, well, all of you reference this, which is so important, a valorization of participatory community-based research now that also has a political economy. But again, I think you're referencing about universities taking it and being like, rah, rah, we're so great. That was a lot, and it doesn't really close anything so much as open it up, but maybe I'll just sort of drop it there for consideration. Such an interesting panel and series of speakers. It was really such a pleasure. I don't know, Harriet, do you want to try and, or sorry, Harriet, Nia, you want to try and round us off?
I mean, there's so much to consider, and I really appreciate everybody's input today and the questions as well. I know that the speakers are happy for some email questions, because I can feel the discussion just wants to continue. So thank you very much for all the interesting speakers and presentations today. There's a lot for us to consider in terms of social change in our roles. But it's also a note to say, don't be afraid. And this is the time for us to think considerably about our research and where we fit in, but also where we can have that impact, along with the wonderful participants that we want to work with, and the importance of their voices throughout. So diolch, thank you to the organisers for starting the series off, and the speakers for a brilliant discussion and presentations today. And Shan, when's the recording onto the website?
Yes, we will publish and we will post the recording on the website soon, in a few days, no more than that.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, everybody.
Nia, thank you so much for your excellent moderating.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you, everybody.